Okay, really huge apologies for the inconvenience in terms of the YouTube stream. I'm going to pick up where we left off, and I'll remind everyone of kind of where we were within the discussion. So, just before I start, okay, it's recording, awesome. So in terms of what we were discussing before, so obviously there's something that we might have to try and fight against in terms of intuition. So for instance, we have this example of attempted murder. And the easy response on a consequential lens is to say, well, we punish attempted murder precisely because of the fact that we want to deter people from planning out murders, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's that basic layer. Now, the other side might be quite competent, and they might be able to fight back with just saying, well, that's probably an inaccurate interpretation. And so part of the act of interpreting a principle is just what ends up fitting. So the other side might potentially say, for instance, that this principle the idea of deterrence doesn't seem to actually match our moral intuitions about why we're punishing something. Because we punish attempted murder, not because we just think it has consequential effects, but because we think someone did something wrong. And that is the essential part of our morality in that issue. And so oftentimes within these kinds of interpretations of arguments and trying to understand whether or not it's a principle or not, we have to interpret it different ways. There's going to be different pushes. But a good way to oftentimes deal with principles is if they have some end illustration which says, this is what grounds our principle. The fact that, for instance, we punish people for attempted murder, even though it might not even have that much deterrence value. And oftentimes, just because we think that there's some moral intuition behind the action being wrong, even though there was no harm done. So this process of interpretation is going to be useful for figuring out whether or not a principle fits into a round and trying to explain what the most plausible interpretation is. So this is how we help to attack intuition pumps. The second kind of modification to this attempted murder example and how it's relevant to debate would be a case like a debate where you say the only thing which matters is culpability, or debates about retribution being the primary thing which matters. And in these debates, you might get a discussion about attempted murder versus murder. So for instance, a really common argument in these kinds of rounds, which I think was also like the Thess round 9. But anyways, a really common argument in these sorts of rounds is to say, well, you should punish attempted murder and murder the exact same because people are equally culpable and equally guilty of the fact that they tried to kill someone. And here again, you might have the potential of being able to outflank their principle through using some kind of consequential analysis and how exactly something happened. So for instance, we don't even need to disagree with the premise here that people who are more guilty of a crime should be the ones who are punished more. But rather, oftentimes, some of these punishments that we're making are usually designed to approximate that moral guilt. So for instance, the reason why we might punish a murderer more harshly than an attempted murderer is not just because you did some harm, but more importantly, because those who commit murder successfully typically tend individuals who planned out that murder more thoroughly and more detail. They're typically the ones who took it more seriously because of the fact that it's successful. And while this is not true in every case, overall, this is a likely interpretation of why it is the case that murder is worse than attempted murder. So even if we can't interpret their principle away fully, we can interpret the context in which that principle applies in a different way to try and illustrate the fact that their principle is still met. So I don't want to understate this because the process of interpreting the principle is oftentimes really, really important for being able to rebut a principle, either by rejecting the illustrations and intuition pumps and thought experiments that they provide at the top using consequential reasoning, or even in the instance where you agree to their metric of morality, you can say in practice, the different sorts of approximations we make with vague or broad guidelines are designed to demonstrate the fact that there is some degree of moral culpability that is higher. So those are two different kinds of basic approaches to staying within a consequentialist bubble or largely staying within the own framework that you've discovered in the debate and still being able to engage with their material. So that's kind of the first discussion. I hope those are good illustrations. If you have any questions, you can leave them in the Zoom chat. So more fruitful and I think interesting part of this lecture. In terms of critique of utilitarianism comes in the fact that it doesn't discern between different preferences. So, for instance, a preference to hurt someone is equally as valuable as a preference to get married and have kids, because all that matters in a consequentialist viewing of a debate or of the world, or even more explicitly within a utilitarian viewing, is that people have higher pain or pleasure, whether or not their desires are fulfilled, whatever metric you want to propose. But certain preferences are illegitimate in and of themselves. Evil preferences shouldn't be accommodated for. So a debate that this might be useful for is in that whole debate about allowing discrimination of people within businesses based on identity. This is actually something I did have to debate at Sheffield IV this last year. And so a really easy reason why it is that discrimination is wrong, even if opposition could prove that net utility or proposition could prove that net utility was higher, is because it factors in the wrong preferences. It doesn't discern whether or not your interest is a legitimate or illegitimate one. So that's one way in which you can have this critique of utilitarianism and how it ends up flowing in debate rounds. Some preferences are illegitimate. We shouldn't respect the preference to discriminate. That seems like a fairly baseline intuitive principle that most people would accept. The second kind of circumstance which we would have a substantial principled push against utilitarianism would be the example of the utility monster. So the utility monster is an example where there's one person who derives utility far greater than everyone else. Every single resource that you end up giving to them ends up making them happier than any other person. And this is another flaw of utilitarianism, because what it seems to indicate is that utilitarianism does not care about distributions. Obviously, most people will say diminishing marginal utility means that those who are most vulnerable will get the most from different resources. But this might not always be the case. So for instance, this might not be the case when expenditure requires a certain threshold, that with 50 bucks, I can't buy an Xbox, I can just buy some games, but with 200 bucks, I get to buy an Xbox and games. That might be an example where diminishing marginal utility doesn't apply. And yet at the same time, the intuition of the utility monster says it is wrong because everyone deserves what they're due. Everyone has a fundamental moral claim to resources or utility that should be equal, even if some people derive more pleasure than other people. And notably, this leads to really bizarre consequences. The idea of utilitarianism says that for someone who, for instance, has significant disabilities, each additional resource to them might be less useful because there are people who can't utilize those resources as well, which is a deeply counterintuitive and wrong principle. We'd say those who are disadvantaged, who can't use resources as well, might even have a better claim towards resources. And so this is another way in which you have a failing of utilitarianism. I'm going to answer these questions in a second, but a good example of a motion in which this might end up applying is the debate about omelos. I'm not sure if you heard about this debate before. It was the Pan Am's 2017 final, I believe. And basically the idea of the motion is you take a random lottery, one random child is subject to immeasurable pain and suffering and just awful life overall. But in exchange, all of society is happy and prosperous and there are less conflicts. And so perhaps this illustration of the utility monster helps to tell us something about these sorts of debates. Because what it suggests is that what matters is not just the total aggregate of what people end up feeling, the total aggregate of utility, but how it is distributed, whether or not it is fair that one person has to take on the burden for the rest of society in order to enhance their utility. So I think the utility monster is a good illustration there to be able to demonstrate this. If you have final kind of examples of why utilitarianism is bad, there's some stuff that Nozick writes, which is not conservative actually, but stuff about the pleasure machine or the experience machine. So for instance, utilitarianism says that it is equally as worthwhile to be hooked up to a machine and fed fake experiences which are pleasurable as it is to experience those things in the first place. Lots of philosophers think that this is a knockdown argument against utilitarianism. I am much less persuaded about that, but that might be another critique you levy. So before I move on to discussing a little bit more about principles in particular and how we run different principles, I'm going to answer the questions that we have. So first of all, what kind of principles can we assume as valid in all cases? This kind of moves back to my introduction when I was talking in the YouTube video, which is almost every debater believes that principles which end up disadvantaging groups, who end up helping disadvantaged groups are valid. So for instance, a group has been failed by the state, they've been actively wronged by the state, they need to be paid back. So all these kind of reparative principles, for instance, tend to be quite useful in debate rounds. And it's also important to note that oftentimes reparative principles are in direct contrast to utilitarian principles. So let's say there's a debate like paying reparations to women. Part of the prop case is not just saying that we're going to help people, because opposition say there will be a trade-off of resources. Part of that prop case is about the fact that women in particular are owed something, that they themselves have some kind of moral desert towards these resources. And so that seems to imply to us to a certain degree that principles which are about reciprocity or principles about benefiting groups who've been disadvantaged in the past almost always stand. But there always has to be a consequential impact that you weigh as more important or less important. So nearly all judges will buy into those things. Next thing, how do you justify intuitively good natural rights? Stuff like parents deserving the right to have their own children. So in terms of justifying intuitively good natural rights, I think that there are some which are more persuasive than others. So I think a parent's right is significantly less persuasive on a philosophical basis. And the reason why is because parents probably have greater obligations to their children than children owe to their parents, is basically what I'm saying. And the reason why is because they voluntarily choose to bring a child into the world, whereas the child doesn't consent. And so under that logic, what should happen is the best thing for the child, because parents have obligations towards their children. So I think sometimes intuitively good natural rights actually aren't that persuasive in debate rounds. And I think you need to be a little bit more discerning of these things and just be like, does it really fit within the principled framework? Some of the things that we generically consider rights aren't actually real moral rights or aren't discussed in literature as moral rights. So it's important, I guess, to just try and discern between those various things. Okay, great. So next I want to talk about some specific principled arguments and how we run them. And I want to start off by talking about obligations between individuals to the state and from the state to individuals. The first thing that I want to start off with as very useful clarification is an understanding what the nature of this obligation is. Because sometimes what the state ends up giving people are actually resources from taxed populations. And the reason why this is relevant is because if the state has committed a wrong, but the resources that they are distributing are resources from individuals, that seems to suggest to us that it isn't going to meet any principled burden in getting the state to pay reparations, for instance. So oftentimes you have to tie the wrong that is being committed specifically to society as a large, because sometimes society is the one who is having to redistribute some resources. This is a really important frame. I've used it before in debates. So in the debate about filial responsibility laws, which is basically children should end up taking care of their parents in the long run, an argument that I've run before is that it is comparatively unjust for the state to be the one who pays for elderly parents and those who are ailing, because those are resources from everyone in society, even those who aren't related towards that individual elderly person. Whereas in contrast, when you have filial responsibility laws, those are obligations that lie directly from an individual child towards that parent. And the only reason why this is persuasive is by deconstructing the state, saying that the state is not the entity who is actually redistributing resources or paying for it, because those resources are people's resources. So this is a really important frame because it will help you outframe a lot of arguments about state responsibility that comes out from the other side. I think it's pretty useful, so maybe just keep that in mind. Now, the first thing that I want to talk about more substantively in this discussion about political obligations is the obligation that the state owes towards citizens, and then the obligation that citizens owe towards states. So between states and citizens, I think that there's a fairly strong intuition that states owe something to the individuals that exist within society. And typically there are two different accounts for why this is the case. Account number one, the state has coerced individuals, and the only way to justify coercion is if there is an arrangement that people would have consented to if they had the opportunity to. So this kind of goes into a Kantian line of understanding of consent, where consent is the most important thing, choice is the most important thing. I'll try and ground this a little bit more later when I talk about individual ethics, but that's just kind of the framework for understanding this whole consent coercion principle. And so if it is the case that you've been coerced, you need to have an arrangement set up in such a way that you are protected. This means that, for instance, you might have demands of the state taking care of individual citizens, and this is why state might have to prioritize their citizens first. They coerce their citizens, no one else. Although perhaps you can argue that states like the US do indeed coerce other individuals across the world. But this is one grounding principle for which we have this idea of state obligations towards citizens. It's subtly different from the social contract because I think it is primarily premised in this idea that the state has so much power over you, therefore it owes you something. The second account of states owing individuals something is an idea of reciprocity. And the idea here is basically that the state mostly benefits from individuals within that state. The fact that people end up respecting laws and are able to create a stable societal framework, the fact that they end up paying taxes, all of these different things can also explain why states have obligations to people, because they owe something in kind for what they end up getting. Notably, this is a really, really big area where most people disagree with utilitarianism, because utilitarianism would say, for instance, that if I stole from someone in this call, stole like $1 million from them, the person I should give that money back to is the most impoverished person in society rather than the person who I stole from, which seems to most people, I think, to be quite unintuitive. And therefore, there's a strong basis in reciprocity. Does that make sense? So those are kinds of two different accounts as to why it is the case that states have strong obligations towards individuals. And this will help ground any arguments about why it is the case that the state has more obligations to citizens rather than other people in other countries. So I just think that is a very, very useful principled argument whenever you need to weigh out relative impacts. Notably, this is not a freestanding principle in the way that I described it. It is consequential in the way that ends up benefiting people who live within that state. So that's something to be cognizant of. Now, talking about political obligations between individuals and the state. And there's oftentimes actually quite a strong argument about why individuals owe it to the state to end up complying with the law. I'm going to just give you a kind of a brief sketch of different areas in which this might apply, different ways to make this argument, and try and give you some application to particular motions. So one account as to why individuals end up owing significant obligations of following the law is the fact that everyone else is following the law as well. And this is important because if you, as in a society, are sharing the benefits of living in a society, the benefits of working on an economy together and creating bigger economic gains over time, or the benefits of stability, then you similarly also have an obligation to share the burdens of society, because these benefits only come from the fact that people make sacrifices with their rights. And therefore, it is unfair for any individual to be able to deviate from this if it is the case that they have benefited significantly from society. So if they've benefited, they need to give back in the same way. And even if it isn't directly contributing, it's about making sure that you follow the same norms as other people do, which ends up allowing for the facilitation of a successful society overall. An alternate conception as to why it is that individuals end up owing something to society is that the state is able to do something which no individual can do. It is able to coordinate things in a coercive way. So let me give you a good example of what I mean. States have the massive capacity to be able to get people to work together and decide on what is moral, even when previously there wouldn't have been any morality. There's no intrinsically moral reason as to why it is right to drive on the left or the right of the road. The moral quality of that decision primarily comes from the fact that the law has said, and that the state has said, one of these options is what we should end up doing, and coordinating around that option is going to be massively beneficial as a whole. If it is the case that the state is able to create this web of law, which ends up coordinating people and making things much better off, you as an individual have an obligation to end up following that law, because that is the thing which is best able to reach the societal objectives that you want. So again, you'll notice this is somewhat consequential in nature. And so the relevance of these two different claims are in various rounds in which you might want to discuss vigilantism. So in a vigilantism debate, every single debate almost always falls in the same way. Prop is going to say vigilantism is good, the state is incredibly immoral, we need some way to be able to hold governments to account. The opposition consequentialist argument is vigilantes sometimes get it wrong, vigilantes aren't always good. In a case where you've been completely burned out from the opening opposition, in closing opposition, you can run a principle about why it is the case that individuals have an obligation to follow the law. Now, notably, obviously, this obligation to follow the law is somewhat limited if the state is unjust. You can tell this from the whole benefit versus burden analogy that I provided earlier. Because if you've gotten no benefits from society, then you have no reciprocal burden to share the same responsibilities that everyone else does. So it is important to note that to a certain extent, these laws and compliance with the law relies on a reasonably just state. Not a perfect state, but a state that is reasonably just. And therefore, in almost any case where a state has completely failed its people, there is no strong reason for an individual to be obliged towards society as a whole. The final political obligation that I want to talk about, and this is both political, but I think you can also view it in a more general moral perspective, is the idea of equality. And I will just go over some brief reasons as to why it is philosophers think that equality is a demand, even in the instances where society as a whole would be better off. So net utility decreases. A basic explanation for why equality matters starts off by explaining why it is the case that inequality is unjust. Inequality is unjust because almost all inequality comes from something that we can't control, that we can't end up making any meaningful choices about. It comes from the fact that we are born at a particular time where maybe the skills that you're born with are valued by the economy. So if you're born in the 1600s, physical skills matter a lot more than skills now. It's also the case that oftentimes the skills that you have are completely arbitrary and they come from genetics. And finally, the fact that oftentimes people are significantly influenced by their environment and end up making choices on that compulsion of how they are shaped by the various environmental and biological factors that exist within their life. And what this seems to imply is that no person deserves what they have. Because if a person has gotten something from completely arbitrary factors, the fact that they were lucky to be born a certain way or born in a certain family, they have no claim towards having additional wealth or anything that ends up stemming from it. So this is a defensive claim against the idea that people have a certain entitlement to what they have. The second idea as to why it is the case that there might be demands of equality comes from a similar idea of reciprocity that I've discussed before. And the idea goes like this. It is not just the case that individuals are reciprocal, or that there's a reciprocal obligation between states and the individuals that live within a state, but also between individuals and each other. The fact that individuals have chosen to follow the law and complied with those things, the fact that individuals have helped make a successful state, seems to suggest to us that the prosperity of society comes from each and every willing person's participation within the state and the fact that they are contributing. And as a consequence, that's a strong argument in favor for equality, that even though no one is morally responsible for the traits that they have in any meaningful sense, the very fact that they engage in helping society as a whole means that there's a reciprocal obligation for everyone to be treated equally because the amount in which everyone complied with the law was equal. The only meaningful difference was something like their natural skills and abilities. So this is one way in which you might want to ground equality and the idea of equality. And equality basically comes from the idea that people should get what they deserve. Now, there are some huge challenges to this in terms of making it a freestanding principle, because sometimes equality dictates that we need to level down. So for instance, equality might require that we end up having less resources overall. And traditionally, debaters think that this is a fatal argument against any side that advocates for equality. I want to make a case for the fact that it is not a fatal objection. I'm going to start off with a thought experiment and then explain the intuition behind the thought experiment. Let's imagine a world in which we have sinners and saints. Naturally, we think that people who are saints deserve more than those who are sinners. For whatever reason, saints have some greater moral claim towards some resources or towards some good. And so, even if it is the case that we make sinners better off and saints no worse off, we might say that there's been some kind of moral wrong done. So for instance, saints get less than sinners in this new hypothetical world. Even though no one is individually wronged, even though no one individually has any harm done to them, our intuition says that there's something that is more important than just consequences. There's this idea of impersonal goods, of justice, of what is right, of what each person is due and what they deserve. And so what this seems to suggest is that even if it is the case that we end up having some degree of leveling down, inequality might need to be rectified anyways, because people need to have what they deserve, and they should have that in proportion to what they put into society or whatever metric for why they deserve certain things. I think the intuition behind this is very simple. There are some things which might be better off for individuals, but aren't necessarily moral goods, because they don't end up giving people the things that they deserve. People just acquiring things isn't necessarily a moral good in and of itself. A moral good comes from the fact that what you have is something that you end up having as something that you deserve. So those are some broad thoughts on political obligations, some stuff between state obligations to citizens, citizens' obligations to states, and finally ending with a discussion about equality. I now want to talk about personal morality and choice a little bit. So first of all, how do we end up grounding choice as a moral good in and of itself? This is really important because the assumption that most people have about choice is that it is only valuable insofar as it helps someone to advance their interests. So the reason why we give choice to people is so that they can determine what is within their preferences, and then they can select these various things. I want to give a slightly stronger account of choice. And for people who've listened to some of my principled seminars before, this might be a recap, so I apologize because this is not new material from that stuff. But the basic idea of a choice argument is that there's no good in anything unless you chose it. And here's a really basic thought experiment to help you understand this. People oftentimes make choices that make themselves unhappy but fulfilled. And on a utilitarian metric, that is completely idiotic. So let me give you an example of this in particular. I might choose to end up sacrificing too many weekends, too many hours of sleeping to debate. It might be a decision that makes me quite unhappy in the short run, but it is a decision that can still make me fulfilled. And what this seems to imply to us is that what meaning comes from things does not come from the inherent quality of how much pain or pleasure it gives you, but it comes from the fact that you chose it in the very first place, that things only have value because you chose it. And the implication of this is that utility only matters because you chose it. Utility is not a prima facie good. It is only a good because people have exercised the human will, the rational will, to select it. Now, here's some more rigorous reasons as to why this intuition might be correct. One explanation that philosophers give, particularly Kant and Kierkegaard, is that what separates us from animals and other objects of other units of moral concern is the fact that we make choices. Because otherwise, if we just went by what gave us pain or pleasure, there's no good moral justification as to why we're any different from animals. And as a consequence, you might end up having this situation where you are functionally an animal without rational choice. You respond to stimuli. You respond to all the external factors in your life and how they change your brain, but you don't make any meaningful choices in and of itself. And so if you believe that there is a distinction between humans and animals, that for instance, in cases where a human is being attacked by an animal, it is probably better for the human to live rather than the animal, then that is partially why that might be the case, because individuals have some kind of rational will, rational choice that is distinct from animals. This is a really important argument for grounding choice in and of itself because it helps to establish that nothing has value unless there is a choice, and therefore we cannot make evaluations as to what people want, and we can't be paternalistic because any value of those choices is completely destroyed in and of itself. Before I move on to the next part of this discussion about individual morality, I'm going to respond to a question. So I have a question here. Is there any argument against the claim for affirmative action by saying that certain groups are more disadvantaged? So I think that the way I'm interpreting this is if, for instance, a group is disadvantaged, like women, is it just to say that we should be helping other groups because they are more disadvantaged? So for instance, intersectionality would say an African-American woman is significantly more advantaged than just a rich, privileged white woman. So trivially speaking, I think it is very easy to make these arguments. So it's a really easy trade-off to collapse the debate by saying there are other groups who are extremely vulnerable as well. And that's partially why the claim for affirmative action is not just based on vulnerability. Part of the claim for affirmative action is saying that a specific group has been particularly wronged and they're owed something. In the same way that if I steal from someone else, I have to give them the money, not just the most vulnerable people overall. A lot of principles about reparations are not just about who is most vulnerable, but about the fact that the vulnerability is caused by a group or a state or an individual, and therefore you need to pay it back. So that's how you end up outflanking this idea that other groups are more disadvantaged. The question of the debate is not just who is more disadvantaged, it's about who caused those disadvantages and whether or not certain people have obligations to make that right based on that factor. Next question, is self-defense valid in all cases? So I think that self-defense is only valid in the cases in which it is reasonable. So, I mean, legally speaking, self-defense is only allowed when there is a reasonable fear of imminent harm towards an individual. So on a legal basis, this is just true. But on a moral and philosophical basis, I think that it's pretty easy to say that self-defense only applies when you can correctly assess the situation as anyone else would and are able to make an accurate decision. Otherwise, the principle of self-defense ends up being quite persuasive, I think, in many cases. Although I do want to point out that the analytical rigor behind the idea of self-defense doesn't seem to be well explained in many debates. So people just say self-defense, intuition, this is the right thing. Whereas I think that the better explanation as to why self-defense is a morally justifiable thing is that no individual should be made subject to someone else's whims and desires. No one should just be an instrument for someone else's pleasure or for their desires or what they want. And in that way, individuals have a right to defend themselves because they can't just be made instruments as part of someone else's good. So this is a somewhat Kantian explanation. Lastly, how do you combat the claims about the lottery of birth? Really, really good question. So I think the first thing to start off with in terms of the lottery of birth is understanding that just because it is random that you are born somewhere, the obligations that you develop afterwards are still valid. So it is completely random, for instance, that I was born in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and therefore it's random that any individual person that I ended up buying something from was the person I bought from instead of some random shopkeeper in Montreal or Toronto. That doesn't change the fact that I have an obligation to pay that person something, because even if it was arbitrary that I was put in this position, the process of engaging in commerce with someone else ends up grounding an obligation to them. In the same sense, while it is morally arbitrary that you're born in a particular state or a particular family, the reciprocal obligations that exist between them through things that individuals do for each other for the state still end up developing. And therefore, even if it's random that you're born somewhere, it is not random that you have obligations, because those obligations are primarily grounded in the fact that you did interact with the state, in fact, and the fact that you did interact with your parents, in fact, even if in some hypothetical counterfactual world, you might have been born somewhere else. So I hope that makes sense in terms of combating the claims about the lottery of birth. Okay. After choice, I want to talk about what is wrong versus what is just harmful. And here I kind of want to just make some distinctions. So the first thing to note is that utilitarianism says that things are wrong in respect of the consequences that end up happening. But we obviously say that there are many acts which are wrong even when they don't cause harm. So the example of attempted murder that I provided before is a great example of this. There are also really, really edgy, provocative thought experiments. I don't want to get into them because they're potentially triggering. But a good thought experiment that I think ends up being useful is the idea of harmless assault. So let's say that you are in a coma. You don't know anything that's happening to you. You won't feel anything. And even afterwards, you won't end up remembering what happens. We'd say it's still wrong for someone to beat up someone who's in a coma, even cause them any harm in any way that they can discern or understand, because this shows a disrespect for their will, for their autonomy. It shows a disrespect for their personhood. And so if you believe in this intuition that there are wrongful acts which don't cause harm, that seems to suggest that the wrong that occurs is primarily in the fact that you don't respect the dignity of another person. You don't treat them as an independent person who has their rights, who deserves some kind of protection, who's equal to everyone else. And this means you can draw on a variety of different justifications. You can draw on the justifications of equality and say every person is equal. Even if they don't end up feeling those harms, they should be treated with the same kind of respect and dignity everyone else is. Those are just trivial claims about the fact that there are wrong acts because you just intended to do something terrible. So if you, for instance, scream awful racial slurs at someone who doesn't end up hearing, I suspect all of us would agree that is a wrongful act, even if it doesn't cause harm because no one ends up hearing it. So, if the tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, it still does fall, is kind of the idea there. A secondary thing that I think is important to talk about is also the idea that there are some harm-causing acts that aren't wrongs. So for instance, it might be harmful for me to cheat on a spouse. But if I'm not infringing on any particular right that they have, it seems difficult to say that this is an action that is wrongful, or at least wrongful to the extent that we would criminalize the action. So this is relevant because sometimes acts which cause harm are not wrong. And if that is the case, then some things should not be criminalized. This is really important for any debate about banning something or about whether or not we should punish people for certain behavior, because it helps us to figure out the framework or the metric for saying something is wrong and that someone is worthy of punishment. The reason why they're worthy of punishment is not just because they end up causing harm. It's oftentimes because they commit a wrong independently of the harm, and oftentimes you might end up having harms that aren't wrongs themselves, which helps to justify why, even though there might be certain harms that accrue from certain things like cheating, we shouldn't end up criminalizing these things. This is, I actually think, quite relevant. There have been motions about things like contracts to prohibit people, like criminalizing cheating or punishing people for cheating in civil courts and things like that. And the implication of this argument is there's some things which are harmful, but should never be criminalized. So those are useful insights when trying to think about whether or not we should ban something or whether or not we should criminalize something. So I have a question here. So do we essentially extend on the same assumptions we have when we make consequential arguments? I'm not entirely sure what that question means. So if you could write that out in a little bit more detail and depth, that would be more helpful for me answering it and helping to explain some kind of meaningful conclusion about it. Finally, on individual morality, I think that there are just a set of different things that are basic intuitions. So all the stuff I talked about in terms of reciprocity still ends up applying. If you end up wronging an individual, you owe something to them in particular, even if it is the case that that is worse for utilitarianism. Really good debate where this might be applicable. The debate about whether or not the NRA should pay victims of, or pay reparations to victims of gun violence. So again, another reparations debate. One side will end up saying, this is something that we owe to another individual. The other side will say, well, we should preference utilitarianism and we should just help the most vulnerable overall. Okay, so the question and responding to it. Okay, so absolutely. We do end up having assumptions we make when we give various consequential arguments. And that's why consequential arguments are so easy. Every debater buys into consequences mattering to a certain extent. The question is how much we care about consequences. I would say that it is almost always safe to be able to develop a consequentialist argument. The reason why we're doing all this kind of stuff is just because I think a consequentialist debate philosophy ends up meaning that it's really easy to get burned out of a debate. Like it is just so simple to run like 4 arguments on OO now, I think, if you're really efficient with your time. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's kind of my broad thought. Motions about torturing someone that did something bad for information or other things. So in terms of this, I think that the central issue here is whether or not this is a just or fair thing to do for an individual. And I think most people, in fact, 80% of people in Germany and the vast majority of people in almost every Western liberal democracy believes that torture is wrong. And the reason why torture is wrong is because you're infringing on someone's will. Now, it's really easy to outweigh this argument because you can say when someone has done something wrong, they're potentially threatening to harm other people, violate their dignity, etc. And therefore, you might end up having a circumstance where on net, you end up getting more utility on the principle. This is just based on how you view a principle. So it is really easy to weigh these things in debate rounds. Philosophers would say that you can't weigh these things, that even if you commit a bad action to undo a different bad action, that is still wrong in and of itself. I think that is somewhat counterintuitive and somewhat difficult to run. It would largely be in terms of individuals having something that they deserve, be more equitable or egalitarian, and to end up weighing out pseudo-consequentialist analysis by saying their moral wrongs are committed more. So that's kind of just a general thought. I think torture is wrong, FYI. I just think that's sometimes hard to articulate why within debate. Okay, some questions that have been sent in. What are some techniques to effectively frame principled arguments or prove they are the most important arguments of the round, especially when running them as extensions? Excellent. So a really big thing is that you need to be super persuasive with the intuition pumps and thought experiments that you provide. The more persuasive these thought experiments are, the more it is likely that a judge will end up buying into your way of seeing the world, and therefore you end up in a situation where you're more likely to be credited. So honestly speaking, the illustrations that you choose for trying to say why a principle matters, those things are really essential. And just pointing out that common sense morality says that we should do one thing over another is oftentimes really, really useful and powerful when you have the illustrations to back them up. Craziest principle that I've ever run. I mean, the craziest principle I've ever run is probably, there are a few crazy principles. The only recent one that I can think of that is not too crazy, but I think was somewhat hard to credit for some judges, was in round 3 of Worlds this year. So the debate motion was about individuals who basically, so I think it's something like children to be able to sue the parents for religious indoctrination. That was the big kind of idea of the motion. And on CO, we just ran a principle, which is those who are indoctrinating children are typically indoctrinated themselves, and they have very little moral responsibility because they don't make any meaningful choices to be that indoctrinator. They typically were in families that indoctrinated them. They're basically victims themselves. This is the same thing as charging a child soldier. That was basically the extent of the extension. Obviously, we had a little bit more sophistication and depth in that, but that was the broad strokes of that extension. We did end up taking a first that round, so it did end up landing, but that was a more risky extension because it was almost freestanding. Like, it was nearly a freestanding principle. It does kind of explain why it is the case that harms to individuals who are obviously like those who indoctrinate others shouldn't be allowed or shouldn't be permitted when it is because of the fact that they have been indoctrinated. But I think it is kind of freestanding in the sense that it just says these people deserve no harm, even if it ends up benefiting vulnerable groups who were indoctrinated as well. So on a utilitarian metric, I think you would usually say, pay the child, give them the money. And the principle is somewhat freestanding in the sense that it says, we don't care about consequences at all, we care about what people deserve. Okay, to new debaters in the format, what are the basic and most important goals in a BP debate in order to win? Framing, mechanizing, or impacting? So as you acknowledge, it is dependent on the debate as a whole. What I will say is that there are different skills which are crucial at different skill levels. So I think mechanizing and impacting is really useful if you're a beginner debater to quite good debater. The moment that you start breaking regularly at large majors, so for instance, you get large breaks at your regional major tournament like NAUDC, Hart House, Euros, Australs, whatever it is, framing immediately becomes the distinguishing thing for lots of the very, very top teams. So I've noticed that in almost every single top debate that I had at Worlds in the break rounds, framing was just such an essential part of it, and people were just framing so much. So I think that to a certain extent, mechanizing, impacting, and responsiveness, all that kind of stuff, very important from pretty good, from beginner to quite good. And then at the top levels, framing becomes much, much more important overall, primarily because framing is oftentimes the most efficient way of rebutting arguments. So yeah. Okay. So next question, can you impact a principled argument without being consequential? Yeah, so I mean, to a certain extent, you can impact a principled argument without being consequential. Example of equality, even when it means that some people are worse off than they otherwise would have been, is a good example of a freestanding principle. So that is the relevant thing. Okay, and then the final question here, on what grounds can the government legitimately restrict self-regarding actions? So I guess this is the question about paternalism. So there are two different competing philosophical frameworks for trying to understand paternalistic policies like banning the use of drugs, etc. One idea is that unrestricted choice is the most essential thing. If people don't have meaningful choices to enter into certain things, then that means that they aren't able to make meaningful choices in their life, and that is not morally valuable. And we should try and encourage that people have the maximum number of choices possible. The alternative side would say, well, actually, in most cases, lots of these actions preclude your rationality in the long run, and therefore you end up not having meaningful choices. So oftentimes it is a principle clash. The principle clash is whether or not you actually have proper or legitimate choices. Ashish has a really good section on this in his principled workshop online. But basically what Ashish says is that it's somewhat foolish to say that just by giving more people choices, they're actually giving more autonomy. Choices are not necessarily the same thing as autonomy. Some basic examples as to how they're not the same. The fact that, for instance, you oftentimes end up having substantial concerns where a person can't rationally choose to enter into a certain decision that is coerced for whatever reason, and it actually undermines their autonomy. So I guess it depends on at what level of abstraction you view choice as important. Is it important to have unrestricted choice, or is it important for people to have meaningful choices that actually facilitate autonomy? So yeah, that is kind of the way that you might want to regard self-regarding actions on a principled lens. Resources are guides on how to mech. I don't actually have any resources or guides on off the top of my head. I'll try and look for something and maybe forward it to Natanya and get that sent to you, but I don't have anything off the top of my head. Okay, cool. So that was a brief rundown of a number of different principles in the debate world. I know that there is a lot. I can't really cover each of them in particular depth given that I have to balance questions, etc. But I guess here I do want to have just an open period. Are there any last questions? Nope. Okay, cool. So I hope this was useful on principled arguments, that helps you to understand the role of principles. Some particular things I want to summarize and highlight. Debates about reparations almost always come down to principles, because if it is the case that you only use a utilitarian metric, reparations to specific groups make no sense. You should be instead distributing them to the most vulnerable every single time. So reparations, filial responsibility, all those sorts of things, that kind of stuff is very important. A second thing that I think is really important, why it is that states have obligations to their citizens first, like reciprocity or coercion, that's completely different from the fictional social contract, which doesn't exist. Third thing that's really important from this lecture, wrongs and harms aren't the same thing. An act can be wrong even if it's not harmful. An act can be harmful even if it's not wrong. This really matters for deciding who should be punished and when they should be punished, etc. What offenses we should punish, all that kind of stuff. I did notice that, James, you did write that you have a question. If you still have it, feel free to ask. If not, then I'm happy to wrap up. Okay, cool. Thanks all for coming and listening to the seminar. I hope that was enjoyable. Final thing is, if you have any questions about this, DM me on Facebook. You can send me a message about this seminar. If you have any questions, I don't know if the CUSID people organizing this are happy to, but if you gave those questions to them and they could pass it on to me, I would be happy to do that. And again, reminder, as Sophie says, to donate. Please donate. This is a really, really important cause. Thanks so much for coming to the discussion. I hope it was useful. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on, Jason.
Jason.
No worries.
If you guys are participating in the seminar, the practice afterwards, feel free to hop onto the Discord now. And yeah, we'll start getting ready for the practice. Also, Jason, you're more than welcome to come if you have time. But like, that's totally optional.
Unfortunately, I have another judging commitment right now, so I would love to normally, but I have to run off to judge a different round.
No worries at all. Thank you so much for coming out. We really appreciate it, and have a good night.
No problem.
Right, the practice debate is going to happen at 7:30. If for whatever reason we have any extra people who want to come, you can come and see whether or not we have the space for you. But only guaranteed slots to people who've already read. Anyway, thank you all so much for coming.